Hello and welcome to the hybrid class session for History 103 for January 26th, 2018, dealing with the French Revolution and its global dimensions. What we're going to do here is I'm going to quickly remind people of what we've already discussed about the French Revolution. Then I'm going to point to the Haitian Revolution in Saint-Domingue, which is sort of the natural result of the French Revolution. Then I'm going to trace some of the other political events that are a direct result of the revolution, such as the wars of independence in Spanish and Portuguese America. And then I'll follow that with what I see are some of the legacies, the intellectual legacies of the French Revolution, why it matters so much, particularly for a course like this. Okay, so just to really refresh our memories, we've traced the arc of the French Revolution here from an early reform movement in 1788, 1789, when the delegates to the National Assembly, first the Estates General and then the National Assembly, really just want things like a constitution and greater free speech rights and consent over taxation. But I pointed out how the revolution radicalizes itself, both due to external events and over some intractable problems: what to do about the Catholic Church, what to do about the king, and what to do about the presence of foreign invaders. And I argued that all of these lead to the period known as the Terror in 1793 to 1794, which is at once a period of a lot of violence where internal enemies are being executed by the revolutionaries, but it's also a period of really sort of direct democracy where more people are kind of engaged in politics in the assembly than ever before. Eventually, however, there's a rolling back of this, starting with what we know as Thermidor, which is the coup that ends up with the execution of Maximilien Robespierre, who was the prime architect of the Terror. And then there is a series of events that basically scale back the sort of the direct democracy of the revolution that lead to Napoleon Bonaparte, who at this point is a fairly prominent general, being brought in as part of a coup, again, to kind of actually roll back the power of the assembly. That's in 1799. Napoleon is much smarter than the people who were bringing him in realize, and he maneuvers to have himself appointed essentially the single ruler of France, what he calls life consul, and then he names himself emperor. That's not until 1804. The point here then is that the arc of the revolution, from reform movement to sort of radical democratic experiment with a lot of violence to back to sort of an authoritarian monarch-like situation with Bonaparte, although with some differences that I'll highlight later. And of course, if we'd had discussion on Wednesday, we would have highlighted the differing visions of the revolutionaries in 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, with the way that Olympe de Gouges, a woman who was a playwright and activist, the way that she highlighted what she thought the revolution was leaving out by 1791. Okay, but this is our basic arc of the revolution as it pertains to France. We'll come back to Napoleon and what he was doing in just a little bit. But now I want to point to the global dimensions of the French Revolution, and those have to start with the island of Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti, the western half of the same island that also now has the Dominican Republic. You look here at the map, it's the island immediately to the east of Cuba. And before the revolution breaks out in 1789, but certainly at this point, Saint-Domingue is one of the wealthiest colonies in the world, and it's driven by coffee and sugar cultivation made possible by slave labor. It's by far the wealthiest part of the French Empire, for that matter. And the population of Haiti, of Saint-Domingue, is divided at the time of the revolution between about 40,000 whites, blancs in French, and those whites themselves are divided between the big plantation owners, known as the Grand Blancs, and Petit Blanc, little whites. These are shopkeepers, other laborers. So they're real divides within the white European community. There are also about if I mentioned this already, there are 40,000 of those individuals. There are 30,000 people we would call the gens de couleur libre, translated into English as the free men of color. These were mixed race individuals who were legally free, although they had seen their kind of legal position eroded over the course of the 18th century. And then there were also 500,000 slaves who outnumbered all of these people. And the revolution, when it begins in France in 1789, is going to mean different things for all of these different groups. Of course, for the Grand Blanc, the big plantation owners, the revolution seems to attack the old regime and the way it had monopolized trade, and it had forced them to only deal with France as their primary trading partner. They really want to both run their own show in Haiti and Saint-Domingue and trade with the United States, which they see as a big lucrative market right nearby. For the Petit Blancs, the little whites, the revolution promises equality, equality with the Grand Blancs. They want to be included at this, on the same footing, despite the fact that they're not as wealthy. The gens de couleur libre see the outbreak of the revolution as a promise of equality for them, but not equality in a broad sense, but equality with the other whites. Right? They want to be treated as legal equals, and be able to serve as officers, etc., etc. All the things that actually they were being restricted from doing before the revolution. None of these groups, these three groups, in any way, shape, or form, think about the outbreak of the revolution as doing anything about slavery. Right. The irony is a lot of the free men of color are actually slaveholders themselves. And so those first three groups are also worried that the outbreak of the revolution will motivate the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue to revolt. And spoiler alert, that's actually what happens in 1791. Slaves, who are really just seeking personal freedom, of course, begin a massive revolt, killing whites and mixed-race individuals equally and burning down plantations, eventually sort of creating this guerrilla movement up in the highlands of Haiti. The French National Assembly, as a result of all this, will actually abolish slavery in 1793, during the Terror, as a matter of fact, basically as an attempt to try to prevent the slave insurrection from going any further. That doesn't really succeed, and the slave revolt keeps going. This leads to a messy situation in Saint-Domingue. In fact, the British and the Spanish also try to intervene here to take over at various points, and they're pushed away. And eventually, power gravitates to the former slaves. The slaves who, I'll come back to this, led by a charismatic former slave named, the former slaves, I should say, led by another former slave named Toussaint Louverture, who really sort of spearheads their resistance militarily. He also resists an attempt by Napoleon Bonaparte, to reassert French control early in Napoleon's career. Most of the invading French die of malaria and dysentery and other tropical diseases. Louverture actually ends up in prison in France, but that's a sad code to this story. France is forced to recognize the independence of what comes to be known as Haiti in 1804, which is really the first. Well, it's the second independent republic in the Americas, but it's the first one not dominated by Europeans. And this independent Haiti greets the day by pronouncing legal equality, dissolving the large plantations, etc., etc. Now, Haiti itself faces a very sad fate in the 19th century. Very briefly, the French put a trade blockade on it. America refuses to recognize it as independence because, as you can imagine, the American government has no desire to recognize a group of former slaves who had gained their freedom given the situation in the American South. Haiti later consents to pay a very large fine back to France that it spends much of the 19th century paying. So the story of Haiti after independence is not really a very happy one. Ironically, it also does inspire other slave revolts in the Americas, and it certainly inspires the fear of slave revolts everywhere. It leads to really a worsening of slavery in Cuba, as a sort of the Spanish government's reaction to what's happening has happened in Saint-Domingue. It also kind of prompts Napoleon to wash his hands of the Americas in general, and the Louisiana Purchase, where the American government purchases French-controlled, at least in principle, territory. That's also motivated by the revolt in Saint-Domingue. So this is a massive, massive uprising, and I think a broader point, too, that I don't have here on this slide, is that the revolution in Saint-Domingue, the Haitian Revolution, forces the French revolutionaries back in Paris to kind of confront the reality of their rhetoric. And it's one thing to say, all men are born free and equal in rights, which is part of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, right? Well, it's one thing to say that, but it's another to have formerly enslaved people take that language literally or say, doesn't this apply to us? And it's pretty clear that almost all of the men of the French Revolution, at least in that moderate period early on, really have no intention in abolishing slavery. But the Haitian Revolution kind of exposes the inherent tensions in their rhetoric that's very sweeping, but that, when push comes to shove, the French revolutionaries don't want to upset the status quo in terms of slavery in the Americas, but they're forced to abolish slavery as an attempt to try to control this revolution. Okay, so the Haitian Revolution is really, really important, not just as sort of this after effect of the French Revolution, but important in its own right. Okay, so that's one really important global, if I've said that already, I've said it 15 times, really significant global legacy of the French Revolution. I also want to point out that the French Revolution, sort of offers the backbone, the basis for the revised army that Napoleon will inherit in 1799. And Napoleon will use this army to really expand all across the European continent. The Napoleonic Empire by 1807-08 really extends all the way into Eastern Europe, much of Central Europe, Italy, etc. And just in the narrative here, the armies of Napoleon will also bring with them a lot of ideas from the French Revolution about destroying feudalism, opening up bureaucracies to people who don't have inherited titles, so that they can sort of function in the civil service. This doesn't really apply everywhere in Napoleonic occupied Europe, but I just point that out as one kind of other shorter term legacy of the French Revolution, is that Napoleon begins to export some of its ideas to Europe in the first decade of the 19th century. The other really big impact of the Napoleonic period, at least in terms of the global legacy of the French Revolution, is what it does to Spain. And quite specifically, the French occupy Spain in 1808. And this is actually going to have a huge knock-on effect in Spanish and Portuguese America. All right, so the Napoleonic invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, that is to say Spain and Portugal, it forces basically the Spanish monarchy to kind of be sidelined for at least 6 years. And what happens is that we'll just focus on on Spanish Americas initially. In the Americas, a lot of the Spanish colonies are already kind of not entirely self-functioning, but local elites are already running the show mostly. And by 1810, many of the elites in Spanish America are questioning their loyalty to this government in Spain. Communication with it's been cut off anyway. And so they form their own juntas or committees to preserve the independence of their regions, of these Spanish colonies, or whether we're talking about what is Peru or Argentina, etc. What they're worried about is actually the Napoleonic armies or French armies tromping around in the Spanish America. So that initially, the moves for independence in Spanish and Portuguese America, particularly Spanish America, are seen as kind of a proactive move against the French. Now, by 1814, in most places, not in all in South America, people loyal to the government in Madrid, which is the monarchy has been restored by 1814. Mostly royalists are back in command in the Spanish Americas, but still, Spanish control has definitely been weakened here. Okay, and I'll come back to the South American story, but let me just point to Mexico as another example. So, well, actually, this map here kind of gives you a sense of the wars of independence. By 1814, you see that Argentina and Paraguay have kind of nominally asserted their independence asserted their independence, again, mostly as a way for local elites to ward off other challengers. I'll come back to South America in just a second. In Mexico, which is a narrative I think some of you might be familiar with, it's a very complicated situation, but in the wake of the Napoleonic invasion of Spain in 1808, in 1810, a secular priest named Miguel Hidalgo issues what's called the Grito de Dolores in 1810, pronouncing Mexican independence. Now, this doesn't actually lead to Mexican independence, except indirectly, and it's not the date we would point to for Mexican independence. Hidalgo himself is imprisoned. What results from this is an insurgency and kind of a low-level guerrilla war up through 1820. Because what happens is that most elites in Mexico remain loyal to the idea of Spanish royal control. Okay, but that shifts in 1820 through another complicated series of events. But basically, there's another sort of upheaval in the Spanish monarchy in 1820 where uh, junior military officers basically help force the king to share power with Parliament. We don't really care about that, but what that does in the Mexican context is that actually emboldens elites, creoles, to shift their loyalties from Madrid to the idea of an independent Mexico. And Agustin de Iturbide is the sort of leading the military arm of this. The so-called Plan of Iguala in 1821 is a union of all the insurgent factions. And this calls for actually a monarchy in independent New Spain. New Spain is what Mexico was called at the time. Equal status for creoles. And it theoretically is going to limit the power of the Catholic Church. It also wants to spread broader rights and privileges for rights, essentially, for more men. So you can see the ideas of the French Revolution actually are kind of percolating here too. Independence is then proclaimed in September of 1821. Spain, of course, doesn't recognize Mexico as independent until 1836. Independent Mexico is first a monarchy, and then later becomes a republic, but is torn by sort of debates really over where to go, and really sort of kind of the same factions of the French Revolution. Debates over how radical to be, how much to punish the Catholic Church, etc., throughout much of the 19th century. So that's, in a nutshell, that's sort of the Mexican wars of independence. And again, really, the point here is that you can see the legacy of the French Revolution both in the way the way the French Revolution leads to Napoleon, and it's Napoleon's invasion of Spain that kind of triggers all of these initial proclamations of independence in some places, and or longer running wars of independence in the first place. But as I've also highlighted here, there are also debates over how to go forward that really replay some of the French Revolution's debates over how radical to be, whether there should be a monarchy, whether there should just be a republic, whether all men have rights, what to do about the Catholic Church, etc. Okay, so that's the story in Mexico. Elsewhere in South America, again, you had sort of initial revolts after the Napoleonic invasion. Much of those by 1814 are kind of pushed aside, and Spanish control is reasserted. But then there will be more than the rest of Latin American colony of South American Spain's South American colonies will actually gain independence. Really, in this period particularly between 1817 and 1821, 22, and in South America, much of the formal liberation, independence fighting, or independence comes through former military campaigns against the folks who are loyal to Madrid. And these are military campaigns, whether led by José de San Martin in what is now Chile and Peru in 1817, 1818, then 1820, or Simón Bolívar in what's called at the time New Granada, which is Colombia, and in Venezuela. Bolivar, for instance, campaigns in Colombia after crossing the Andes in 1819, and then he sort of this remarkable expedition over the mountains, liberates Venezuela in 1821. And a key part of the story is also here that, as I already alluded to, there were problems back in Spain. Again, Spain doesn't really mount much of a formal military response because there's been essentially a revolt by military officers loyal to a parliament that is kind of hamstrung the monarchy. So problems in Spain mean that the Spanish government doesn't have much of a forceful response to these wars of independence. So essentially what Bolivar and San Martin are doing is they're fighting against royalists in place and a little bit of Spanish support. In Brazil, which of course was a Portuguese colony, Brazil's story is also quite complicated. Again, it's triggered by Napoleon. The Portuguese monarchy had actually fled Portugal in 1808 and had been hanging out in Brazil. And then there's basically a family argument between two factions of the family that lead to the formal proclamation of Brazilian independence in 1822. point is that the net result is that there are a string of independent countries dominated by local Creoles, local Creole elites, mixed-race elites. And yeah, I don't want to downplay their significance. There are some minor changes to territories, etc. But the colonial state's framework, that is sort of the actual administrative units, mostly remain, and its social hierarchies remain too. The local elites who had been in control, kind of quasi been in control before all this began, now are formally in control. And in the 19th century, much of the story of South and Central America is that independence doesn't change the social reality for most people living there. Most people remain very poor and impoverished and sort of locked in hierarchical relationships. And these post-independent states are often quite unstable and dominated by military men, heavily influenced soon by the commercial influence of Great Britain or by the influence of the United States. They really are part of the world economy mostly as exporters of raw materials ranging from wheat to bird poop or guano. So I don't want to downplay this as a global legacy of the French Revolution. I think it's an important global legacy of it. But I want to also suggest that what happens here is basically independence without hugely changing social hierarchies. Okay. All right, so I've traced the global kind of immediate political legacies of the revolution, whether it's the Haitian Revolution, whether it's Napoleon tromping around Europe, and what that brings, or whether what happens to the Americas. Let me finally conclude here, words that you're all excited to hear, with the intellectual impacts of the French Revolution. Okay, why it's so significant in the long term, beyond the sort of shorter term political disruption that it causes. On the one hand, it certainly destroys an old order in France, this old order going back to the Middle Ages, one based on hierarchy, one characterized by a lot of sort of private laws, or actually hold off on that thought, categories where one's place in society was dictated by where one was born and what your parents did. Now, I don't want to suggest that this suddenly overturns this and everyone's equal. That's not true, but certainly in the case of France, it overturns a very hierarchical society and certainly opens up space for men, particularly of more modest birth, to rise in society, to be appointed to positions of authority. In the more abstract sense, the French Revolution really creates or makes prominent the idea of the nation, this place that everyone living in has some sort of shared loyalty to. The nation is one's prime kind of form of reference, mode of loyalty, and nationalism, that is sort of the sort of loyal, connection or feelings of pride in one's nation. Right? The French Revolution really brings this center stage for the first time. Instead of people being well, at least in the abstract, loyal to a monarch, now they're loyal to a nation. And we can see this playing out in a lot of ways in the case of France. I already showed you that map of pre-revolutionary France, which is uneven, it's arbitrary, it's based on all sorts of random things in the past that dictated the administrative regions of the 1770s. After the revolution, France is divided up. A new map literally is created, so the nation is being remapped with what are called départements, or departments. Each one is roughly the same size. Each one has a department seat that's in the middle. And the names of these departments are based on geographical figures. They're not sort of the older historic names. So that's one way that the revolution quite literally is creating a new nation. The French Revolution is also creating a new nation in other more abstract ways. During the revolution in France, places get renamed. Everything that has a name that's connected to the monarchy gets changed to something else. People rename themselves. A lot of people, well, almost everyone in France has a name that's based on a saint's name, a Catholic name, in 1789. And a lot of people rename themselves so that they're no longer Louis or whatever sort of saint name they have, but they're named Constitution or Rhubarb or Brutus or Spartacus, names that come from either classical antiquity or nature, right, or political events during the Revolution. The French Revolution also I've pointed out the way it remaps France. You notice that this is a highly rational map. The French Revolution ushers in the metric system, which is a completely different way of measuring distance. It's a standardized base 10 way of measuring weight and distance, in contrast to the patchwork kinds of measures of weight and distance that were in place before. So it's standardizing them. The French Revolution also tries to remap time, and I mentioned this before on Monday, but it creates a new 12-month calendar with, 12 months each is 30 days divided into three 10-day weeks, so it's a metric week. Each month is named after some sort of natural phenomenon, like Thermidor for hot, or Fructidor for fruity or harvesty, Brumaire for foggy, right? You can see what this is really trying to challenge the way people think about time. They thought about time in ways that had been dominated by the 7-day week, where Sunday was your day for church. The revolution is attacking the influence of the church, as I'll come back to, on people's lives, and so reshaping time seems like a way of doing that. So all of these are in the specifically French sense of writing the nation, but I would argue for you that in positing that it was the people of France who were the supreme authority, the power was vested in them. This is not a completely novel idea. Enlightenment philosophers have been talking about this, but the French Revolution is really the first to put this in motion in a way that not only broadens who belongs in the people, but directly challenges the validity of a monarch as having any kind of sort of reference for those people at all. Okay, and it's not. I don't want to suggest that people automatically everywhere start thinking in terms of the nation after the French Revolution. That's not true, but certainly the French Revolution's nationalism will be a very powerful force in the 19th century, going forward, particularly in Europe, and that'll have a real impact on the world. Going forward, too, then, I've pointed to the destruction of feudal institutions in the nation, other kinds of intellectual legacies. The French Revolution accelerates the movement for abolitionism. Now, this had begun much earlier, obviously. There was an Enlightenment critique of slavery based on the grounds that it was inhumane. There was a lot of religious opposition among groups like the Quakers to slavery already in the 18th century. And there was also the growing idea that slavery wasn't a great practice economically. But certainly the French Revolution brings in a massive slave revolt. It also leads to the abolition of slavery temporarily in French territories. Napoleon will reinstate slavery, I should point out. But the revolution itself kind of ushers in this moment of abolition. There will be then slave revolts in British colonies in the Caribbean that will lead the British to abolish slavery the sale of slaves within the British Empire in 1807, and then to lead to the legal emancipation of those who were still enslaved by 1834, and to kind of take up the anti-slavery cause. Many of the revolutions in South America formally abolished slavery, although not everywhere. Slavery doesn't get abolished in the United States, of course, until the Civil War or after the Civil War. Brazil is the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery formally, and that's in 1888. The end of slavery, of course, doesn't always change labor and race relations, doesn't lead to political equality in a lot of places, and in fact, plantation labor continues in places where slavery is abolished in the Caribbean. But in the second half of the 19th century, one witnesses a huge flood of indentured servants who really are not that much better off than slaves were before. Indentured servants from India and China brought to the Caribbean, to Peru, to Brazil, Hawaii, etc. That's not part of our story right now, but so I guess my point here is that the French Revolution is a watershed moment in abolitionism, although it doesn't lead to the immediate end of slavery. In fact, slavery lingers in various ways much longer, but that the French Revolution accelerates the drive to abolish slavery. The French Revolution also does sort of give credence to ideas about the equality of women, and we saw this particularly with Olympe de Gouges. And this is a very important part of the revolution. On the one hand, you could look at this very pessimistically and say, well, the French Revolution ultimately doesn't really change the status of women, even in France, because the National Assembly never actually goes beyond things like granting women the ability to divorce more easily. Um, Women don't get full political rights during the revolution. That's not going to come until very much later really in the 20th century. But again, so that's part of the revolution. Part of the French Revolution is denying the equality of women. But it also opens up this space for women to claim, say, like women like Olympe de Gouges, to say, hey, we belong. We merit the same rights as men. We are inherently have those same rights. So I think you can look to the French Revolution's impact on feminism in a couple of ways like that. And then finally, the French Revolution will also, particularly the idea not just of political equality, but of social equality and equality in terms of property. Now, the French Revolution really doesn't advance this idea. It's too radical, even for a lot of the revolutionaries. But the earliest groups that are going to call themselves socialists are going to come out of the French Revolution. They're going to be frustrated that the French Revolution didn't go far enough in terms of dealing with private property. And again, one of the huge driving forces of the 19th, 20th century is the movement that's going to call itself socialism and then later communism. With a huge impact on the whole world. So these three things, thinking about what I've traced here already, that the whole idea of the nation and nationalism, the acceleration of abolitionism, the ground platform for women, people arguing for the rights of women, and the sort of platform for people who are going to argue for a much greater kind of equality based on sort of the equality of property ownership. These are pretty radical legacies. I want to point to just two other ones in conclusion. One is that the French Revolution really does challenge the authority of the Catholic Church temporarily, and much of this is restored by Napoleon. But the revolution gives full rights to non-Catholic groups, and it also does things like make divorce possible. This is important both in France and then, as I alluded to in kind of confusing fashion, it also plays out in South America too, in a lot of the post-independence states. Really challenging the church as a source of authority in one's daily life. The revolution, ironically, kind of pushes forward the state as the replacement of the Catholic Church, as the sort of arbiter of private life and private conduct, which is another legacy. And then finally, violence. Obviously, the French Revolution is accompanied by a great deal of violence. Yes, it's accompanied by a sense of the possible and a better future, but there's violence everywhere. And I think this is part of what the revolution's radicalism. It does bring this sense of reordering what is possible, and violence accompanies that. All right. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this was not too boring, and thank you very much. I'll see you next week.